All right, good morning, folks. I'm Jason Franken, and looks like we have 4 papers for this session on entrepreneurship and agribusiness. I guess the general format is we're going to have presentations of 15 minutes and about 4 minutes for discussion, or 3 minutes for discussion and 4 minutes for other comments and I guess questions during that time, and then move to the next presentation. So to kick us off here, we have Fabienne Femenia,
and I was like,
farmers' heterogeneous responses to price variation.
So I made a map because I have an undergraduate degree in geography. So I grew up in Fargo, North Dakota. You can see my little house there. I did my undergraduate at the University of Minnesota, and then I went to graduate school.
Hi. People,
Between my master's and my PhD at Purdue, I interned with
people online, could you please mute
that's that
your
little
microphone?
green lines there.
I can do
A
it.
return
Nice. Okay, so good morning, everyone. I'm Fabienne Femenia, and I'm presenting a paper co-authored with my colleague Elodie Letour. We're both researchers at INRAE in France. In this paper, we focus on the short-run response of dairy farm to market price variations, and more precisely, we stick to characterize this short-run response, the flexibility of dairy farms in this response, based on a panel smooth transition regression approach. This work is part of the European H2020 project MindStep. So the closely related concept of farm resilience, adaptive capacity, and flexibility have often been put forward as key elements of farms' economic sustainability in the face of increasing climate variability and volatility on agricultural markets. The capacity of farmers to adjust their production decisions in the short run can indeed allow them to benefit from, or at least to limit the profit losses induced by external events such as changes in market conditions. Also, there have been a lot of economic studies on the long-term adaptation of farms to global changes. There is, to our knowledge, a few studies, in fact, on their short-term adaptive capacity, which we call here farm flexibility. Yet the farmers' ability to temporarily relocate their resources in the face of sudden events is an important issue, as underlined by Donald. And this short-term flexibility is of particular interest for dairy farms. In fact, since feed concentrate and milk prices tend to vary a lot from one year to the other, there are significant variations for these farms in both input and output prices. And dairy farms do actually have some degree of flexibility to adjust their feeding strategy in the short run to cope with shocks. This has notably been shown in the technical livestock production literature. So a lack of flexibility can be attributed to the existence of adjustment costs that might be due to the rigidity of quasi-fixed input, administrative costs, or other costs. All these costs are likely to be generated by different farm characteristics, which can bring a lot of heterogeneity in the farm flexibility in response to price variations. Several frameworks have been proposed in the agricon literature to account for the impacts of adjustment costs on farm production decisions, notably in the dynamic farm investment models. Capital adjustment costs are introduced to represent the difficulty of farm to adjust their capital stock from one year to the other, but these models are more designed to study the medium or long-term behaviors of farms, which is not our case here. Other models, microeconometric models of crop production decisions, have introduced implicit adjustment costs of acreage to account for the acreage diversity motives of farms. However, these models do not account for adjustment costs in the farm input use decisions. Another framework recently proposed by Ernell is of particular interest for what we think to do. This framework recognizes that because of adjustment cost, firms, adjustment of input quantity in response to price variations depend on the magnitude of these price variations. And two cases are in fact possible. Adjustment costs can either increase or decrease with the adjustment of input quantity that is necessary to respond to price variations for firms. In the first case, if they increase, adjustment costs are convex and thus becomes more important for higher input adjustment. And thus, firm adjustment of inputs are less important for higher price variation. Whereas in the other case, if they decrease, the adjustment costs are non-convex and the opposite arise. From an empirical viewpoint, Enel proposes to represent this by estimating a threshold regression model of input uses, where input and output prices coefficients are allowed to take one value for price variation that are rather small, below a certain threshold, and another value for price variation above that threshold, so that you have two types of response to price variation, depending on the magnitude of these variations. Our main objective here is to identify the heterogeneity in dairy farm flexibility based on their short-run observed response to input and output prices. And to do that, we will rely on the approach proposed by Enel. That is, we estimate a model of dairy farm input uses, where farm responses to input and output prices depend on the magnitude of the price variation they face on the market. Our main contributions compared to Enel's work is that we do not impose here a single threshold level common to all farms to distinguish a response to small versus large price variations. We do not rely on a threshold regression approach. Instead, we use a panel smooth transition regression model, in which we assume that the transition function between one type of farm behavior to the other one are farm specific. And we introduce random parameters in our model to account for the unobserved heterogeneity of farm flexibility of farmers' behaviors. So here is our model. We thus have a system of input use equations where the quantity of input Y of input J for farmer I in period T is decomposed into a sum of individual farm-specific effect, alpha 0, and a sum of effects of explanatory variable, X and Z. And we add a stochastic term to represent the potential effects of external shocks, such as climate events on input uses. As you can see here, some variables of our model, which are in Z, have the same effect for all farms on input uses, whereas other variables introduced in the vector X have effects that varies among farms and with time, because they are multiplied by this function G. So G is what we call a transition function. It's a logistic function of a variable Q, which in our case will be the magnitude of price variation on market. It also depends on two types of parameter, gamma and C, which are farm specific. So to illustrate the interpretation of this G function, I've represented here on this graph standard logistic functions, which just varies between 0 and 1, depending on the value taken by the variable Q. And in our model, two extreme cases can in fact arise. For value of Q of our transition variable, which are way below a threshold, which is the C parameter in our model, the G function is equal to 0. In this case, the parameter associated to the variable X, which are input and output prices, are equal to beta 1. So the price response to input and output prices is equal to beta 1. In the other extreme case, for high price variation way above the threshold, the price response of farm, input price response of farm is equal to beta 1 plus beta 2. We thus have here two extreme types of price response, and between them, we have a smooth transition. And the speed of this transition depends on the gamma parameter. So in our model, we have different individual farm-specific parameter, the farm-specific effect first, alpha 0, and the parameter of the transition function. We assume that these parameters are random to account for the unobserved farm heterogeneity. Finally, for a model, we make some assumptions on the distribution of the stochastic term of the model, that are the error term here, epsilon, and the random parameter of the model, which are assumed to follow a normal multivariate normal distribution of expectation mu and a variance covariance matrix omega. So the parameters we want to estimate in our model are the fixed coefficient in our model, beta 1 and beta 2 and alpha 2, and the parameter of the distribution of the stochastic term of the model, psi here, mu and omega. We thus have a fully parametric model, so we can rely on a maximum likelihood estimation procedure. Here is our log likelihood for the model. So it's equal to a sum of individual log likelihood here, which are themselves equal to the integral over the distribution of the random parameter delta of the observed choice of farmers conditional on the individual value of the random parameters. Because of this integration over the distribution of the random parameters, this maximization problem does not have an analytical solution. In such cases, econometricians usually rely on a simulated maximum likelihood approach. This kind of approach is difficult to implement in our case, first because we have multiple integrals, and also because some explanatory variable of our model depend on the G function, which itself depends on the random parameter. So we have chosen to adopt another approach based on expectation maximization algorithms, which are frequently used by statisticians to estimate random parameters model. We have also, with some other colleagues, recently used this kind of approach to estimate economic models of crop production decisions. So here we rely on a stochastic version of this of an EM algorithm, the AAEM algorithm. I won't go more into detail in the estimation procedure. So the result I will present here have been obtained on a panel data of more than 400 dairy farms in the west of France, which are observed for 10 years. The dependent variable of our model, the input uses are the feed concentrate, the grassland acreage shares, and the fodder maize acreage shares. The input and output prices for which we allow different farm response depending on the magnitude of price variations are feed concentrate and milk prices. The other explanatory variables of the model are crop and fertilizer prices. And finally, the transition variable we use is the variation in input to output price ratios compared to the previous year in absolute term, which means that if this transition variable has low value, it means that milk and feed concentrate do not vary much, or even that they vary in the same direction. So for farm, it's the same. There's not much market price variation. So here are our main results, so estimated responses to prices. What we have to retain here is that the price parameter are significantly estimated and have expected signs. The parameter characterizing the transition functions are also significantly estimated, the parameter of the distribution, and show a significant heterogeneity in farm behaviors. Most importantly, what we can see here is that if we compare the value of beta 1 and most importantly of beta 2, beta 2 represents the change in farm behaviors for large price variation compared to small price variation. What we can see here is that dairy farm for larger price variation adjust more their feed concentrate than for small price variations, but adjust less their acreages of maize and grassland. So it seems that at one point, when market price variations become too high, farms are no longer able to change the land allocations in response to price variation because it becomes too closely, so they just adjust their feed concentrate quantities. So they become, in fact, less flexible for higher price variation. So the later they change their behavior, the more that farms are flexible. We thus consider that for higher threshold level, estimated threshold level, farms are more flexible. So just to give some insight on the reasons why they might be more flexible in their adjustment of feeding strategy, I've represented here some summary statistics for different value of the threshold level. So the fourth quartile here corresponds to the most flexible farms. So what we can see here that the farms that are more flexible use less feed concentrate and use more farm produced food, and also that there are more organic farms among the most flexible farms that adjust their feeding strategies. So as a conclusion, we can say that here we have proposed an original framework to identify the non-linearity in short-run responses of dairy farmers in France to variations in input and output prices. This model is estimated based on a panel smooth transition regression model of input uses with individual random parameters, and is estimated based on EM algorithm. The first results we obtained on the sample of dairy farms in the west of France show evidence of nonlinearity and heterogeneity in farmers' response to price variation, which suggests that the simulation results of short-term effects of prices on input uses could be biased if this this heterogeneity of farms is not taken into account. Further investigation is still needed to better characterize and understand farmers' behaviors in each regime of price response. And its framework could also be applied to other farmers' production choices, notably the use of pesticides. That's it.
One of my questions is, so I grew up on a dairy farm and other components, and it's like, what was agriculture potentially, what considered farm situation? Like, what is the average farm size, and how would that compare, like, would it be expanded to farms in Minnesota or farms in California?
Yeah, honestly, what I can say is that in this region of France, Brittany, the farms are rather intensive and rather big compared to other farms in France. Those farms I know are comparable to those that you might find in the Netherlands and so on in Europe. Now, compared to Minnesota farms, I think they may be smaller. And I don't know how much of farms in Minnesota, how do they feed their cows? I mean, do they use a lot of grassland, fodder maize and so on, or do they have more feed concentrates? And I mean, do you? A lot of homegrown. Oh, okay. So this could be comparable. I think in that case, this framework could be also applied to this type of farms. It would be more difficult for highly intensive dairy farms where cows are essentially fed with concentrate and so on, and no home produced food. Co-ops? Oh, okay. Yeah, we also have that in Brittany, especially in Brittany, because this is actually the region where I live, so I know that. And for that farm, yes, you have a lot of cooperatives that well provide advices to farms and might help them in choosing their feeding strategy. Yeah.
Leading to people later, but specifically co-ops both in dairy potentially can help on both sides. They might help
stabilize or manage output prices, but also getting a resource input. So I think it's more, it's another interesting dimension to add to give participation of co-ops to change their transition strategy, because
Yeah, that would
they
be,
haven't really done managerial input.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I think so. Well, this is an information we have actually in our data sets, if they belong to a co-ops or not. So we could, this is something we could look at and see if those belonging well or having a co-ops are more or less maybe flexible. But in this sample, I think that's maybe something like 80% of the farm belong to a co-op. So yeah, there's a lot of specifically in that region. Okay, yeah.
This is more of a technical question, but it seems like the definition, so like the key finding here is that there's this threshold, things
Yeah.
vary on either side of the threshold. And the threshold variable you said was a change in the input output price ratio.
Yeah, well,
So,
Mhm.
so is that thing then like if you have 2 years in a row where a farm sees, let's say, very high output prices, that in that second year, there's no change, and we shouldn't expect them to respond or like that, or am I
Yeah.
following that?
well, actually, if there's 2 years, well, yeah,
Or
What-
2 years in a row. Of
2 years in a
very
row,
low
they, well, yeah, they don't adjust. Well, they keep the same behaviors actually. As
So,
they,
okay, so.
Yeah. But well, what we look at is how they adjust really their input when the price variation is really high. So if you have 2 years in a row of very low prices from the previous year, they won't adjust anymore. I mean,
All the investment happens all at once.
yeah,
It's sort of something.
yeah. Yeah, but you know,
About whether that's-
yeah. But the two behaviors, you know, since we have a smooth function, they are not contrary to owner's framework. We don't have just two extreme type of behaviors. I mean, we have this smooth thing, which means that if the price variation is a little, well, if you have a little bit of price variation, even if the prices are a bit less low compared to the previous year, then you will have a response a bit different.
Okay. I didn't know if you shared the whole thing.
Yeah, so people like me, remember that we said to the year
Okay. All right. And you don't use that one.
Oh, this. Can you guys that are on Zoom see the slide? Okay, okay. All right, so I am Becca Weir and I'm a graduate student at the University of Minnesota. And today I'm going to share with you the financial performance of beginning dairy farmers in Minnesota. And this is part of my master's thesis research. And I'm working with my advisor, Jolene, as well as Becca and Alessandro from Colorado State. And this research is funded through a USDA ERS grant. So first of all, here's a quick snapshot of what the dairy industry looks like from a demand perspective. over the last 45 years, demand has increased by over 100 pounds per capita. So while we have increased demand, many of our farmers are nearing the retirement age, with over 36% over the age of 65. In addition to many of our farmers nearing retirement age, we have a low percentage of farmers that are entering the industry at less than 20%. There's creating this gap of farmers that are leaving the industry, and we don't have farmers that are entering the industry at the same rate. Additionally, in Minnesota, the number of dairy farms has decreased by over 50% over the last 12 years. So the purpose of this research is to compare differences in the financial performance of 4 farmer groups, which are beginning, established, second generation beginning, and transitioned to established farmers, and identify characteristics that drive the financial performance for each of these groups. And in this research, I use FinBin data from Minnesota dairy farms from 1996 to 2021. So I've started talking about beginning dairy farmers, but what is a beginning farmer? A beginning farmer is someone with 10 years of experience or less, and an established farmer is someone with more than 10 years of experience in the industry. And there are a variety of programs available for beginning farmers. At the federal level, there's the Farm Service Agency that provides loans for farmers to apply for, and NEFA provides grants that beginning farmers can apply for. And at a state level, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture provides loans. And more specifically, Minnesota offers a farm business management program. So basically what this program is a farmer will work one-on-one with a farm business management instructor to work together to basically make a plan for the farmer's business goals. And this program is not free because nothing is free. However, beginning farmers do receive a 25 to 50% tuition discount participating in the program. And finally, this program, so these farmers are working with that farm business management instructor, and they're actually contributing data. So we're able to actually look and see if these farmers are meeting those financial goals that they identified or not. And we are able to track them annually to see their performance and increases over time. All right, so the FinBin data, so this is the largest nationally representative farm financial data source. And this is real farm data. This is not survey data. And there's also, so if you go on the website, which is listed in the bottom corner, you can access all the data in aggregate, but I have access to the farm level data. So I'm able to look at that specific level. And it includes a variety of information, including financial data, operator characteristics, as well as in 2014, they began documenting whether a farm was a beginning farmer participant or not. And then specifically for my research, I have data from 1996 to 2021, and I have over 3,000 farms in my data set with over 13,000 observations. And within this, I did restrict, I did put a requirement on that these farms had to have 3 years of data because, in order to be included in the analysis. So farms that were only in the data set for 1 or 2 years, I excluded. So I briefly mentioned those 4 groups before, and I'll describe them a little bit more here. The beginning farmers, again, farmers with less than 10 years of experience, established, more than 10 years of experience. The second generation beginning farmers are farmers that took over an already existing operation. And I used 2 criteria to create this group. The first is, so within the data set, I have farms that have a start date of 1980, for example, and then later on the start date changed to 2000, yet it has the same FinBin identification number. So therefore, these farms that had that change in start date, I considered a second generation beginning farmer. And the second criteria I used was that some of these farmers were labeled as beginning farmer participants, but they had over 20 years of experience. So if that was the case, they were also considered a second generation beginning farmer. And then finally, I have a group of transition to established farmers. So these are farmers that are established farmers, so they meet the 10-year experience criteria. In addition to that, they were also in the data set as a beginning farmer. And each of these groups are mutually exclusive. So each year, each farm is allocated to one of these groups. And just to see what proportion of the data that these make up. So about 14% are beginning farmers. Established farmers make up the largest chunk at 73%. And second gen and transitions are 3 and 10% of the sample. So diving into the methodology a little bit. So first of all, we wanted to see, are these groups different? Does it actually matter if I'm a beginning farmer, a transition to established farmer, an established farmer? So I used the KS test to test for the equality within these distributions, with the null hypothesis being that they're equal and it doesn't matter what group you're in. And so here are the results for that. So I use a pairwise comparison. So I look at beginning and established, beginning and second gen, and I do a pairwise comparison of each of the two groups. Or I use two of the groups and I compare each of them. And at the 1% level, everything is, or at the 10% level, each of them are significant, meaning that we reject the null and their distributions are not equal. The group matters, which group you're in. Operating profit margin. I should have mentioned that. That would be useful. So then going from that, the next step was to use the first order stochastic dominance methodology to determine whether there is differences within the full distribution. So to understand what first order stochastic dominance is a little bit, here's a brief example. So I have a vertical line at the 10% level, and you can see that there are 40% of second gen farmers that have an operating profit margin of 10% or less. And for beginning farmers, 60% of beginning farmers have a operating profit margin of 10% or less. So in this example, we would say that second generation beginning farmers dominate beginning farmers and that they have a higher expected value for their operating profit margin. So here is the plot of that. And as you can see, these functions, the cumulative density functions, cross at some point throughout the distribution. So there is no difference in distributions within these groups. However, if you look at certain ranges, for example, if you look at a range of like 5 to 25, you can see that the second generation beginning farmers have a lower expected value than the other groups. And that range, they are dominated, which then motivates us to use an unconditional quantile regression. So we're able to look at the 10% level and see how are farmers in the 10%, like at the 10% operating profit margin doing? What is impacting them? What about farmers at the 90th percentile? What is impacting them? And we can look at those differences. So the unconditional quantile regression is derived from an if function, which essentially assesses the impact of adding or dropping an observation. And then this is used to create the RIF, which determines where those quantiles are. So it determines where the 10% is, where the 30%, etc. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to thoroughly go through this because there's a lot of results. So here's my model. So my dependent variable is operating profit margin. And then I look at those 4 farmer groups, so the beginning, established, second generation beginning, and transition to established farmers. And I use a variety of covariates, including operator characteristics, farm characteristics, herd characteristics, and farm financial characteristics. And I included some summary statistics just on the operating profit margin, and I did a Windsorized and non-Windsorized version. What Windsorizing is essentially, I took values that were below the 1%. So if this is our 1% level, values outside here were replaced to have that value of the 1% level. And I also did that at the 99% level as well. So values that were exceeding the 99% level were reset to the 99th percentile. And based on this, we can see that each of these farmers have what's considered a poor operating profit margin. However, this is a 26-year average, and prices are highly volatile within the dairy industry. So actually receiving 9 cents to 14 cents of retaining that profit on the farm is quite substantial. All right, and then the explanatory variables. So first, thank you. For the farmer type, so for the operator characteristics, I included those 4 farmer types that I've mentioned, as well as the number of operators and an off-farm indicator. So this off-farm indicator is simply a dummy variable indicating whether the farm received off-farm income or did not. For farm characteristics, I included herd size. So I have categorical I have 5 different herd size groupings, and I omit the smallest one of a herd of 1 cow to 50 cows. I also include acreage and percent of acres owned. And for the herd characteristics, I include milk yield, the percent change in milk yield, a herd health indicator. So this herd health indicator essentially is a dummy variable based on vet expenses. If we have herd health concerns, then it has a value of 1, and it is based on whether, like, what the proportion of vet expenses are relative to your total operating expenses. And then I also included the feed cost per 100 weight of milk. And finally, the financial variables that I included were the interest expense per head, depreciation expense per head, labor indicator for whether the farm had high labor expenses, government payments as a percent of total revenue, and finally, the current ratio. Here's a quick snapshot of what the farm size is. So beginning farmers have the smallest farm size, second generation has the largest farm size or herd size. And it is similar when we look at milk yield, with beginning farmers having the smallest average milk yield per cow. All right, so the results. So what I did, I have a variety of unconditional quantile regressions I ran. Initially, I ran one including each of the 4 farmer groups, so I have a full subset using those 13,000 observations. So that includes those dummy variables with the established farmers as the reference group. And then I went and I did just the beginning farmers, just the established farmers, just the second gen, and just the transition to established farmers. So what you're looking at right here is the results when I only looked at the beginning farmer observations. So just to highlight some of the significant ones. So for farms at the 10% level, the off-farm income indicator was significant and positive. So this indicates that these farmers may be working off-farm and gaining skills and knowledge that they're able to take back with them to the farm to be more successful and profitable. Herd size was negative, so and as crop acres was positive. So initially, these beginning dairy farmers should focus on increasing their acreage relative to increasing their herd size. The herd health indicator was positive, which is opposite as expected. You would think that if a farm has herd health concerns, that would lower their operating profit margin. However, in this case, we find it to be positive. So this may be the case that these farmers are actually proactive and that they have higher vet expenses relative to their total operating expenses. And then finally, the government payments percent. So this was also positive and significant, indicating that participation in these programs is an additional revenue source for these farmers. And then this slide, essentially, I grabbed all of that. So I just went through the beginning farmer results. And now this is just basically a big summary of all of them together. So for established farmer, these operator characteristics don't impact their profitability. The transition farmers actually see a decrease in the addition of operators. So for these farms, the cost of hiring that additional operator is higher than the return that they have from the specialization that they provide. And then off-farm income increases profit for beginning and second gen. From the farm level characteristics, for the beginning farmers, we just mentioned the herd size decreases profit and the acreage increases it. And this is exactly flipped for the transition farmers. So early on, these farmers should increase herd size and later on increase their acreage, excuse me, I said the opposite. They should increase their acreage initially and then increase their herd size. The herd characteristics, milk yield is consistently significant and positive, and those beginning farmers with the herd health concerns had a positive association. And then hired labor was only significant for the established farmers. And when we look at the government payments, this was positive for the beginning farmers, but negative for those other 3 groups. So finally, what are the key takeaways from this whole presentation and this research? Off-farm work is important for those beginning farmers to possibly increase their profit, and they can gain those skills and knowledge from those other outside sources. Increase acreage initially, and then increase your herd size as you've gained some experience in the industry. Utilize government programs that are available. And while there are government programs that are available, they are in, if I'm a first gen, a second gen, a specialty crop, a dairy farmer, I have the same exact programs available to me. So it might be valuable to reevaluate some of that policy to modify it based on first generation, second generation, or what type of farmer you are. And I open the floor to questions.
About suggestions to modify the policy. Can you tell me more about what you would have in mind if you were in charge?
Oh, if I was in charge. Well, I think like right now it's so, I understand that it's very challenging to regulate. If I were to divide it out based on you're a first gen, you're a second gen, you're a third gen, you get this, you get this, you get this, or you're a crop farmer, you get this, or a dairy farmer. But I think there should be some division within that, but I'm not sure what it should be at this point.
Profile of the getting farmers that are entering, which is the profile of the farmers that are experts in the data. So obviously a lot in exit. I'm just curious, how similar or different they are. Or the basis of it, the newer younger farmers doing something different. They're doing organic dairy, how are they trying to get a foothold in this, like a tidal wave, people leaving?
Yeah, so that is a good question. I don't have a very good answer to it. We noticed a similar thing where there were, like, I had over 2,000 observations that only were in the, that participated and had data for the like 1 year or 2 years, and the last participating in the program. So we no longer have data for them. And organic farming is something that we're going to look into probably. I just didn't ask for the variable initially, so I don't have data on that. Yeah, thank you.
To clarify that, it's less the data, but it's not farming.
No. So that because this program costs money, so it's possible that these farmers just didn't want to pay for the program. And the Finbin data is unique, so it doesn't have a normal distribution. There are some farmers that are participating because they want to be proactive. They want to maximize their profitability, for example. And there are other farmers that are required to participate for lending and other like resource constraints.
There's a lot of non-owner farmers that they were like one of the different states to people if they're an owner for the community.
That is a good question.
I said the neighborhood together all owners and if they are participating in this program and then getting the fund and something like that. You have to be part of that happening. SPM, so if you're enrolling in the process. I get more on the other side, but there are a lot of properties who don't have to be here when they come out. It doesn't matter in Minnesota, that's great. That's not even when I do that.
You said,
Even though I am right. I believe that even though I'm trying to solve the
So I have data on land, like I have total acreage and I have acreage that are owned. So within the, so I did include like the percent of acreage owned, and it was, yeah.
the data, didn't get part of that just a protection or panel?
Panel.
A panel, but then you should also analyze the variation of your income. Is there a difference regarding the group, or you just presented the things here and indicator of the variability of your outcome? And the second question is this potential energy analysis, where you explain profit by farm group. But it's the case that there is a selection of second generation farmers because the farm is so productive.
So to answer your second question first, so the second gen farmers, so, okay, so I did look at the net farm income. And that is highly correlated with farm size, so I didn't want to include it, but beginning farmers did have the lowest net farm income. And the second gen farmers had the highest net farm income on an average, which is consistent with the herd sizes. The beginning farmers herd sizes was like 88 cows, and the second gen was the highest at 170, I think it was. And then, so like, we saw that and we thought that some of our second gen farmers are likely being more successful or more profitable due to their increased herd size, but they also have that older generation that's likely still helping with those management and other decisions that are happening on the farm. That helps them. So my thought on that was that if they increase their acreage, they're able to provide more feedstuffs. Like they're able to do more homegrown feedstuffs versus purchasing feed. So if I start my operation and I just buy a whole bunch of cows, I'm gonna have to buy a whole bunch of feed. But if I start my operation, I have a set number of cows and I increase my acreage, I'm able to actually provide homegrown feed, which is more cost effective than purchasing usually.
Yeah, well, actually, the question I have is suggestion I have is more based on your so your answer. Okay. Here. I would be happy, well, I have different comments, and I would be happy to discuss with you after the session. But just quickly, maybe one or two comments. First regarding the option prices. So it's new into the outside very lot of money after the other. Do you, I mean, when you do, for instance, just to get this dominant and analyze, you take all the skills for all your students and so maybe since price is very a lot, you're comparing this really different market conditions for different types of farms. So I was wondering if you have tried to do kind of your price over your service so that you show that all the farmers are facing the same price. You know, maybe in that case, you find more capital on the product compared to the other.
Okay, so in my unconditional tile regression, I do include a year fixed effects.
Okay.
But when I did like the operating, like the stochastic dominance, I just lumped it all together.
But yeah, in the partnership model, you have that here.
Yeah.
Another quick question is I was wondering, since your database is really great, but since based on that partnership program, I was wondering if the students from that sample, well, and the research is from is not biased. Maybe they enter the science program because they have faced some difficulties, there are less performance than the other students.
Yeah, so that was, I kind of mentioned that earlier with like it's more like a bimodal distribution versus a normal distribution.
Okay.
So we do I'm sure there's some bias, but I think it alleviates some of it with having farmers at both ends of the distribution versus having like only the proactive farmers or only those farmers that are having a lower.
Yeah, maybe we're going to say, I think there's the second type of farms we have that were first beginning farmers with the beginning program and keep them in the center. Maybe you could use, I would use this second type of farm to really have comparable users and farm and see how they evolve so that we still pretty have a really large comparable farm. So this would be like, so I have other suggestions.
Thank you.
So we've had a couple about dairies and we mentioned co-ops. And so now I'm going to talk mostly about co-ops and I'll mention dairy. So again, I'm Jason Franken. Got to acknowledge my co-author, Michael Cook at the University of Missouri, well known for his work on co-ops. And so I've been working on a few things with him. Of course, this is one of those papers. And so the title is Conditions Conducive for Collective Action in Agriculture. We're basically looking at under what kind of situations might we see co-ops, or might we be more likely to see co-ops. Got started on this kind of in a strange way. I was sitting around thinking about what's really different about agriculture as an industry and how can we justify having agribusiness programs as opposed to just business schools and econ departments and such. And a couple papers that I've read in the past kind of spoke to me on this topic. One's Alan and Luke's The Nature of the Farm, creative play on Coase's The Nature of the Firm. And in that paper, they talk about how ag production is, of course, intrinsically tied to Mother Nature. And as a result, we have levels of risk and uncertainty that are different than what you might see in other industries, and that bring about these monitoring and measuring problems. It's really hard to tell if the level of effort is entirely what's responsible for the outcome, for instance. And one way of handling that has been the family farm. If the family benefits, everybody in the family benefits. So those family workers have the incentive to put forth the best effort and that sort of thing. Of course, as a result, unfortunately, the family farm is constrained in size to that which the family can handle and manage. At some point, mama says, no more. We're not having another kid just so we can have another 50 acres. All right. So Valentina recognizes this and says, look, given the limits of the family farm in size, you don't really see farmers dealing with businesses up and downstream that have those same sort of scale limitations. They can adopt corporate models and get big and enjoy those economies of scale, and therefore maybe have some market power that then gives a role for co-op to come in and help counterbalance that market power. So that's the argument for Valentina for why we see co-ops. And those are some things that are maybe different in agriculture than another industry. I can also think about it from Williamson's transaction cost economics point of view, where he talks about these hybrid type of businesses. It's not markets, it's not hierarchies, it's something in between, and co-ops kind of fits in there. And those hybrids exist at intermediate levels of uncertainty and asset specificity. Asset specificity is the degree to which an asset is tailored to a specific exchange relationship or would have less salvage value outside of that relationship. So I basically test some ideas from some of these papers using readily available USDA data. And here we have that data. So I have the percentage of non-family farms by commodity, the percentage contracted by commodity, and the percentage of that commodity handled by co-ops. And it's not all exactly the same time period, so I match things up as best as I can, and USDA quit collecting the data on co-ops at some point. So we have some limitations here, but we put together stuff as best we can here. And then we also have a measure of asset specificity from a PhD dissertation at the University of Missouri, where Mario Mandelli was a student, and he surveyed ag lenders about their perspectives on asset specificity. So it was a survey item from 1 to 7, 1 being low specificity, 7 being high. And there was 4 different kinds of specificity. Physical, where it's the actual physical assets used in production process. Humans, so know-how and expertise. Then there's site and kind of location relative to processors, etc. And the last one is temporal specificity, essentially perishability. And basically, I just averaged all of them real quick to have a variable. It seems perishability pretty much drives it, though, just kind of eyeballing it. So what we do here is then we examine the shares, the percentage that's contracted, and the percentage of co-op handled across commodities, and look at some of the ideas from those various papers. And for instance, Valentina's explanation for co-ops, when we have a higher percentage of family farms, then we can hypothesize that we're going to see a higher percentage of co-ops for those commodities. From Williamson's explanation, basically the idea is higher asset specificity up to a point leads to greater use of hybrids, in this case co-ops, I kind of break it down, disaggregate it a little more. Another way of looking at it from transaction cost economics is higher asset specificity leads to more contracting, and more contracting or contracting costs lead to vertical integration, or in this case, quasi vertical integration in the form of co-ops. So those are the hypotheses I test. Here's my data. And so that's a big bunch to look at, lots of different colors and stuff, and maybe hard to disentangle all of it from where you're sitting. If you had it printed out on a piece of paper and looked at it real carefully, you could draw some conclusions, I think, that I've got written down up here. I guess starting off, just tell you, basically the solid lines are the percent handled by co-op, and black is milk, yellow is grain, like corn,